A reading from the book of Kings, chapter 19. God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Here ends the reading. Has the word of God come to you in so dramatic a fashion? Has the word of God happened to you in such a thrilling way? Perhaps you were sound asleep at night and suddenly awakened as if by a clap of thunder. You sit up straight in bed to the sound of sheer silence. There in the dead of night, what did Yahweh armies say to you in that language without words? Did God speak to your heart? Did God say, "What are you doing? Stop it right now"? Or maybe God said, "Don't just sit there, do something now." Today's reading from the book of Kings has always struck me very profoundly, especially the passage about the still small voice. Have you ever noticed that this phrase seems to change in different translations? In today's reading, we heard the NRSV translation, which says, "the sound of sheer silence." The King James Version says, "still small voice." That's a phrase that continues to ring true in our ears. Still other English versions say something like a murmuring sound. Why is this? Let's take a closer look and listen to what God is saying to us today, here and now. So we'll start with translations. I looked at the Latin. Curiously, the Latin version says, "Sibilus aure tenuis," a sound of hissing in your ears that won't stop, just keeps going on. The Greek says, "Phone auras leptes," the sound of a light breeze. And finally, the Hebrew version, "Kol demama vakah." And I give you my translation, "a voice silenced and crushed." Certainly all of these versions have a different kind of poetry, but there's a reason we still keep the Hebrew text within reach. The Hebrew alone evokes, to me at least, a personality and a story, a theology. In these three short words, the Hebrew text leads us to think of Jesus Christ, the theology of the cross, and God's mission to the broken-hearted people of the world. God's voice in this text is not the voice of the storm god, but of the tornado victim, not the pyromaniac god, but the burnt, not the mighty rock breaker, but the voice of the crushed. God's voice in this text is that of Jesus Christ on the cross, humiliated, stripped naked, and shamed. So let's break it down. Kol. That is the Hebrew word for not just any sound, but a voice. And not just a voice, but it's a call, a proclamation, a voice that says, gather round, everyone. A voice that says, listen to me. It's also the word for thunder. Whenever you hear God say in our scriptures, listen to my voice, obey my call to you, it uses the Hebrew word kol. On to the second word, demama. This is the word used when the waves are stilled, when the mouths of the scoffers are silenced. It means both silence and whispering, murmuring. What kind of silence is this? The silence that ensues when someone has been shut down in an argument or a discussion. The silence that descends when people no longer feel safe speaking their minds. Sometimes the cost of brash, vocal opposition in the face of oppression is that the dictator imprisons them, then tortures them, then puts a bullet in the back of their head. So our small voice is not just quiet, it continues making noise in protest. It is the volatile, angry silence of the oppressed. It is the murmur of the crowd that dares not to speak openly. It is the cry of the poor. And we know that God hears the cry of the poor, that the complaints of the Egyptian slaves ascended to heaven and reached God's ears. So in this phrase, kol demama vaka, God speaks with the voice of the silenced. And finally, the third word, vaka, usually translated as small or low. Small or low, those English words of ours are pretty neutral. In Hebrew, the word vaka comes from a verb, the verb for grinding and smashing. Grinding wheat into flour, smashing rocks into dust. For example, when Moses came down the mountain carrying the Ten Commandments, he saw the golden calf. He seized the golden calf and ground it into powder. Then he put it in water and made everybody drink it. So the voice of the silence is not just small. It is small because it has been crushed and pulverized. Think of a huge boulder, so big you can't pick it up or even move it if you push real hard. But if you keep pounding and pounding on it, day after day, generation after generation, boatload after capsized boatload of fleeing refugees, family after family torn apart by economic exclusion, the American dream systematically denied over generations. That is what is meant here by that call. Motes of dust so tiny you can't even sweep them up because the minute you disturb them, they become airborne and ascend upward. Perhaps the word gravelly captures it. So we put these three words together, kol demama vaka, the stifled, broken voice. What does this make you think of? I think of the mewing of a kitten, the whimpering of an infant, the moaning of a slave. And this is God's voice we're talking about. No wonder Elijah was drawn from the cave. There's something irresistibly compelling about hearing and responding to such a pleading, plaintive, pathetic little cry. The sound of it breaks my heart. Pity melts my spirit. I hear that sound, and my ears perk up. I spring into action. I go to check it out. In short, this weak, pitiful cry is, in and of itself, a summons to mission. Well, enough of these three Hebrew words and all that we can learn from them. Let's zoom out and hear this phrase again in its place in the story. What happened just before Elijah heard the still small voice? And what did the voice say? Well, Elijah is on the run from King Ahab and his evil queen Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel led the northern kingdom of Israel. They led the people away from the true God, our God, known then as Yahweh armies. They had led people to worship Baal and to do terrible things to show their religious observance. Now, in our story, Elijah has just proved that all of Jezebel's religious leaders, the priests of Baal, were frauds. Elijah had them killed, every last one of them. Well, this upset Jezebel. So Elijah took off, alone, into the desert, 40 days without food. Finally, he comes to the mountain of God, Horeb, the very place Moses had met God face to face and received the 10 Commandments. Elijah finds a cave. He was drawn out by our silenced, crushed voice. And what, in the voice of the crucified, what is the message that God gives him? Well, here is what God says. Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. If you're unfamiliar with the rest of the story, it sounds like Elijah is going to go immediately out and do what God has commanded, in order. That is to say, first go find Hazael in Damascus, Syria, anoint him king. Then go find Jehu, son of Nimshi, anoint him king. Then find Elisha, he's your replacement. But that's not the way it worked out. Elijah leaves and finds Elisha, his own replacement. Then Elijah ascends to heaven while Elisha watches. Only long after that, maybe years later, Elisha anoints Jehu as king over Israel. And only long after that, maybe some more years later, we finally meet Hazael, king of Syria. Curious, God has presented Elijah with a to-do list in reverse order. Why? Well, I thought about it, and I think it's because God is speaking to Elijah from the future, from where all of this has already happened. So from God's point of view, he sees Hazael first, and then Jehu, and then Elijah. Perhaps there's some deeper point to all of this. If so, I just don't see it. The second thing you probably don't realize about this to-do list is that Hazael will be king of Syria, an enemy of Israel. Hazael turns out to be a thug, a really nasty guy. When Elisha comes to anoint Hazael, Hazael was just a captain in the army of King Hadad. And Elijah weeps when they first meet, because he knows how many Israelites Hazael would kill. Once Hazael finds out that he's going to be king, he murders his own king that night, suffocating with a wet blanket. It's a story a bit like that of Macbeth. The prophecy about Jehu is very tragic as well. Yes, Jehu finishes the job that Elijah had started with the purge of the priests of Baal. Yes, he will kill off all the idolaters, bringing the Omride dynasty to an end. But the details are not pretty. You can't believe the depths that people of God had sunk to. And the bloody means that Jehu uses are horrifying. God is not kidding about the sword. What for? Why all this bloodshed? God says, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. There is going to take place a great reduction of Israel's size. Yet God will leave a remnant. Anyone alive to hear this word, anyone with ears to hear today, is part of that remnant. We're it. In particular, I hear this phrase from the point of view of the readers and the listeners in the Babylonian captivity, who knew only too well how crushed Israel would become. This phrase portends destruction, yes, but from the vantage point of the future, it contains a promise of rebirth. So in conclusion, after all you've heard today, I want this word, this part of the story to stay with you. There was a tornado, a terrific thunderstorm, and Elijah stayed put. There was an earthquake, and Elijah hunkered down. Then a forest fire. Elijah just kept out of it. But then, after all that, Kol Demama, a voice calls of one who has been silenced, beaten down. A call, very insistent, one who's lost a lot, and yet who carries on. This nagging voice will not let you sleep. This one who calls you will prevail in the end. Listen. Can you hear the voice of Yahweh armies? Then cover your face. Venture out of the cave.